Good morning, folks. I'd like to share with you my most recent essay, which I think has particular resonance this week in the light of the most dramatic and outrageous invasion of the sovereign nation of Venezuela by the imperial regime in Washington. So, Carthago, Delenda est, a warning to Indigenous sovereignties. Indigenous peoples require no warning about the ongoing Western imperial project. They have lived its consequences across generations, naming its violence in their own languages, through their poetry, their scholarship, their art, with an unyielding resilience and an indomitable spirit of resistance. They have resisted it with forms of knowledge the West has systematically ignored, misunderstood or suppressed. Indigenous peoples worldwide know well enough not to ever mistake treaties, recognition, promises, partnerships, apologies or inclusion for safety. The title of my essay may appear didactic, but it does so not from a position of revelation. It's offered as articulation, not a discovery, but as a naming of a structure Indigenous folks have long known, while the West continues to deny, rebrand or moralise it. So, Carthage must be destroyed. The Roman insistence was ruthless, declarative, absolute. It was not a cry of passion, but a non-negotiable premise of empire. Just business. A statement of inevitability. Today the phrase finds renewed resonance. From ecclesiastical origins in the proto-corporate Catholic Church, through chartered companies such as the Dutch and British East India Companies, to settler colonies, industrial empires, and the contemporary military corporate order, the same logic persists. Domination without limit, consumption without restraint. This logic tolerates no rival worlds, material, cultural, or spiritual. It cloaks its insatiability in the language of progress, humanitarianism, civilization, security, or moral duty, but its orientation remains unchanged. Western empire is not merely expansionist, it is self-consuming. It devours peoples, lands, cultures, and ultimately its own values, leaving behind landscapes of ruin that signal both historical continuity and present danger. The logic that produced empire does not yield willingly. It adapts. The formal age of European colonialism is often said to have ended in the mid-20th century, replaced by a world order grounded in sovereignty, international law, and humanitarian norms. This framing mistakes a shift in language for a transformation in substance. Western imperial and neo-imperial impulses were not abandoned. They were legalised, softened, and rhetorically sanitised. Imperial power persists as a continuous civilisational impulse, periodically re-articulated through changing moral, legal, and economic vocabularies. While empire is not unique to Europe, the Western tradition developed a historically distinctive form: settler colonial, universalising, endlessly expansionary, and increasingly abstracted from place, reciprocity, and limit. This genealogy can be traced from the Roman inheritance of universal law and abstraction, through the Catholic Church's fusion of moral universalism with perpetual legal personhood, establishing domination as righteous and permanent. With the emergence of early modern chartered companies, most decisively the English and Dutch East India Companies, this logic was secularised and corporatised. Violence, extraction, and conquest became functions of legally autonomous entities operating for profit, shielded by distance, abstraction, and bureaucratic insulation. Settler colonialism represents the most radical expression of this logic. Unlike empires that sought tribute or hegemony, settler colonialism sought replacement, elimination of Indigenous presence, enclosure of land as property, and erasure of prior ontologies. Industrialisation amplified these dynamics, transforming the global south into permanent zones of extraction and sacrifice while rebranding exploitation as development and progress. In the 19th and 20th centuries, imperial power further disguised itself through doctrines of security, intervention, and global order. Power came to be exercised without annexation overtly, domination without acknowledged rule. The Monroe Doctrine, the rise of the military-industrial complex, and the institutionalization of economic coercion mark a transition from territorial empire to planetary management. Today, even ambitions to colonize outer space do not represent a rupture with this history, but its extension. The same assumptions recur: emptiness, entitlement, destiny, and limitless expansion. What is expressed is not technological optimism, but a metaphysical refusal of finitude and reciprocity. The enduring feature of the Western imperial mindset is therefore not conquest alone, but the inability to imagine genuine power sharing or coexistence without hierarchy. The language changes, the structure remains. Treaties, interventions, and development regimes function less as vehicles for shared sovereignty than as instruments for managing resistance while preserving Western strategic and material advantage. Where conquest once spoke openly of domination, it now speaks of stability, development, and humanitarian intervention. The form of consent is preserved, its substance is withheld. This continuity is not primarily the result of individual malice or bad faith. It is structural. Western political and economic systems were built through centuries of external extraction, and their stability continues to rely on unequal access to resources, labour, and strategic influence. To relinquish imperial advantage would require material contraction, a cost Western states and institutions have consistently resisted. For Indigenous peoples worldwide, this history carries an unavoidable warning. Whatever language Western corporate, military, and political elites adopt, partnership, recognition, treaty, or humanitarianism, commitments repeatedly dissolve at the point where real sovereignty, land, resources, or autonomy are at stake. Rhetoric proliferates, power does not meaningfully shift. This is not an indictment of Western peoples as such. Many within the West are themselves subjected to extraction, surveillance, militarization, and economic precarity, mobilized in service of imperial projects from which they do not benefit. Structural victimhood does not negate structural danger. Western power, even when internally fractured, remains outwardly organized, adaptive, and resolute in preserving advantage. If empire's outward logic is domination, its inward consequence is decay. Having exhausted lands, peoples, and meanings, monopoly capitalism increasingly turns inward, consuming its own foundations. Cultural homogenization accelerates, entertainment becomes spectacle, dissent is aestheticized, spiritual life commodified, human agency displaced by algorithmic governance and technocratic management. The unrestrained pursuit of increasingly autonomous artificial systems, undertaken without collective consent or ethical containment, represents the purest expression of this logic. The outsourcing of decision, meaning, and survival itself. The system does not collapse from external enemies, but from the impossibility of its own endlessness. The empire's death throes are visible at its core. Chemical epidemics hollow communities, homelessness expands amid obscene wealth, ecological systems are poisoned and exhausted, institutions decay while spectacle intensifies. What emerges is not progress but regression, devolution, entropy, a drift toward corporate feudalism, managed desperation, and punitive moralism. This is not civilizational failure by accident, but the predictable unravelling of a system incapable of restraint. Western imperialism is not merely a historical phenomenon, but a metaphysical disposition, an ever-restless drive to universalise, abstract, replace and expand, incapable of genuine reciprocity, because it cannot tolerate limits. What began as conquest of peoples became conquest of the earth, and now gestures toward the conquest of the whole cosmos, not as exploration, but as continuation. Empires no longer announce themselves as empire. It arrives as obligation, expertise, or benevolence, insisting always that there is no alternative. History suggests otherwise. Carthage was not destroyed because it was evil, but because it existed. The warning endures.